Hey, welcome back. Thought I'd join the video today with my face, so good to see you. I'm Dave Fisher. We've been going through the Gospel of John every week by week, and we are at the very end. So this is our last small group meeting, and we're doing John chapter 21. Just kind of as a heads up, this is a Rolls Holman small group, hence the shirt. And so we've been going through it week by week, and this is the final one. This is our 23rd meeting or something like that. And we're doing what is surely one of the funnest chapters I've ever seen with John 21. There's been a lot of great chapters in John. I don't deny that, like the Lord's Supper, chapter 17, like that's like some intense, like important things. But there's like important things in 21. It's just lighter. It's just fun, right? Every time with these meetings, we've started off with kind of the purpose of the book, which is listed at the end of chapter 20. We'll get into this quite a bit. Where it says many other signs were done in the presence of the disciples, which were not recorded in the book. But these are written so that you can believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, that by believing you can have life in his name. To be honest, that's like the rear view mirror now, because we're into chapter 21, which people call the epilogue, which I'm starting to kind of like take offense to that term. So this chapter has two amazing stories in it. The miraculous catch of fish, and then the restoration of Peter. So we're going to get into these in some depth. Before we dive in, let's cheat and just kind of look at this summary statement idea we've had going. So I always list every time in these the Gospel of John purpose statement as listed in the one we just read, right? And we've seen purpose statements a little bit. We talked about it some in chapter 19, chapter 20 as well. Chapter 19, I would have called the purpose statement. John's like, the man who saw this has given testimony, and his testimony is true. And we know that he tells the truth, right? And so that was kind of the 19 one. And really, what's happening in chapter 21 here, my dog's joining us, is that we're getting summary statements that kind of combine things, right? So the summary statement is the final two verses of this chapter. This is the disciple who testifies to these things. So it's talking about the disciple whom Jesus loved. It's very explicit when it says it. And he wrote them down. So he gave the firsthand eyewitness testimony. So it's his. But then the editors just say hi for the first time ever with like almost the very end of the book. We know that his testimony is true. And to be honest, this is a surprising statement when you read it, because I think the whole time we've kind of been assuming that John himself wrote this. We think of like single authors of books. But for the first time ever, we see that there's editors, right? And so this is probably a common thing in other Gospels, but it's even more present in John. And it really raises a lot of questions. And it raises the question of like, was John alive? Like when they finished this, how much did they do? Like did John write the whole thing and they just barely touched it? Or did John just have like loose leaf papers everywhere and they kind of wrote most of it? Hard to know. Personally, I try to think about things. I try to use my imagination some. And then I see if the pieces fit together. To me, I think that really John's dead is the first thing I'll say. So I think that they finished the book without him. So the disciples of the disciple whom Jesus loved finished up this book, maybe did quite a bit with it, and they were editors throughout. And in fact, one of the first pieces of evidence is I don't think there's any way John would have boasted that he was the disciple whom Jesus loved, right? 0% chance. So this group of people who loved John and were happy to give him full credit as the one whom Jesus loved, named him, right, as that. They didn't say John, but they gave him almost more credit than just saying his name. And you actually can see that they've done this. They've like propagated all the way to chapter 13 where it happened. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about that. Other things about this purpose statement is you can actually kind of see there's the 21 purpose statement matches the one that we label as the purpose of Gospel of John. Jesus performed many other signs. Jesus did many other things as well. And all of a sudden you think about this word signs and things, and you can actually see this is the summary of not all of John. It's actually the summary of chapters 1 through 11. And so all of a sudden you realize but chapters 1 through 11 are trying to convince people to believe, right? And so these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you can have life in his name. And so really, this is just a summary of 1 through 11, and then this is a summary of 12 through 21. And it's a continuation in the chain. So he saw it, he knows it's true, and then we got it straight from him, and we know that his testimony is true. And so it's this unbroken chain from John as the first-hand eyewitness to this group of editors, and then on to us, right? So it's just really neat that it's this continuous chain. And so really, this is a summary of the second half, and then they finish with a fun, kind of like light thing. If every one of them were written down, so these are written down, I suppose that not even the whole world would have enough room for the books to be written. And so you obviously can't put this summary statement in 20 because it's just kind of crazy. But it makes me realize that really talking about it as the epilogue, we always say it's like the epilogue, like an add-on, like people question whether this thing was like authentic or added years later even. That's really not appropriate, right? It's just that conclusion statement here was so strong that we decided, it must be an epilogue. But I really don't see it that way anymore. In fact, I see 18 and 19 as a pair. So arrest and trial, crucifixion. So they're a pair. They go together very, very well. And then 20 and 21 are a pair. And we'll talk more about how similar they are when you look at it. It's just that they both end with kind of this summary statement here. Another thing just to mention, people, this is to rebut people who think that 21 was added later. There are ways that you can try to look at this, nerdy ways. And so one thing that we did from chapter 8, if you just kind of remember that, we looked at the number of unique words and divided that by the total number of words, because I'm a nerd like that. And we saw that like that story with the woman caught in adultery was clearly translated by somebody else. It was put into Greek by someone other than John, or now we shouldn't just say John anymore. We should say John or this community of people that finished this gospel for John. So how do you explain it? Well, I think the best way to explain it is actually the way they did in Acts. So they realized that Peter and John were ordinary, unschooled men, right? And so the people that wrote this with John, they weren't Greek scholars, right? They probably didn't even know Greek as a first language. They were just normal guys, right? And so this chapter here was written by somebody that really knew Greek, right? So it was more likely like a Luke or a Paul type of thing. They made it. They did not include it. So perhaps just use your imagination. Let's say it was a story from Luke that Luke didn't include, right? It was just kind of like floating around this Luke story. Well, these guys, these disciples of John, they knew that the story was authentic. They'd heard it from John, and they put it in, right? There's nothing like that going on here, right? And so don't think that 21 is anything different than 20. So that brings us to where we're at in the big wheel. So we've been doing this wheel every time as we go along. Chapter 21 has 549 words, so it's just a little bit shorter. It's more on par with the things that would have happened in the farewell discourse. It's going to be a couple of stories. It's going to be a story at the Sea of Galilee first, the fishing, and then there's going to be a thing with Peter. Now, just to mention in advance, there was a meeting of Jesus and Peter before the people reported from the road to Emmaus, before Jesus met with the 11. So like on the day that he rose, he met with Peter. It's an elusive story. Luke talks about it in his gospel, but doesn't tell it. Paul talks about it in his letters, but doesn't tell it. And then here we've got a really detailed story with Peter that happens at the Sea of Galilee. And there's questions of like, where does this story belong? Did this really happen earlier? Is it displaced? Or so lots of interesting things there we'll look at. Let's lay some background before we dive into the stories today. I think you probably already kind of know the stories today, but we'll lay some background. So at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, one of the first things he did is he collected disciples, right? So apostles is the term we'd use for the innermost 12. This is listed in all the synoptics pretty similarly. Matthew 4 has the story of how Peter and John and James, Peter and Andrew and then James and John were collected. And so it's as Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee. It has many names, sometimes Sea of Galilee, sometimes Sea of Tiberias, sometimes Sea of Gennesaret. It's all the same lake. He saw two brothers, and you can see that Mark is almost exactly the same. By the way, this is Mark 1:16, right? So this is the beginning of Mark's gospel. And they were casting a net. Fishing. How did fishing work? No fishing rods. We get fishing rods out of your brain. They took a net, which is what's called a casting net, and they threw it into the water. And we'll watch a video later. But it would sink to the bottom, and then they would pull the rope, and the rope would kind of like cinch together the bottom. And then as you kept pulling, the bottom would become the top, and you had basically a sack of fish, right? So that's how they would. That's how they catch fish. They were casting, cast fishermen, which is fun. Jesus says to them, "Come, follow me." Keep that in your brain because that's going to be important at the very, very end. So come, follow me. I will send you to fish for people. Classic lines, just so fun. Same in Mark, right? At once they left their nets and they followed him. So there's a lot to do. Jesus is just getting started. And the thing we're going to see in this story is that Jesus is dead, buried, resurrected, and it's still the same thing. You got to keep on following. So really nothing's changed. From there, he went a little farther and he saw James, the son of Zebedee. I think it's funny because if you think about when Mark and Matthew wrote, John hadn't done much, right? Like it wasn't, John didn't, so it's listed as like James, the son of Zebedee. Oh, and by the way, his brother John. And so he's like an afterthought, which I think is funny. They were in a boat with Zebedee preparing their nets. These nets are so important. And Jesus called them as well, and he said, "Follow him." And so there's this repeated follow him, follow him, follow him that we're going to see. Luke tells the story as well, but Luke actually has a lot more details. You can see these are almost identical. Luke tells it in chapter 5, and we get an 11-verse detail here. He was walking by the lake of Gennesaret, so Luke changed the name of the lake to Gennesaret. It would have been another name for the same lake. And people were actually listening to Jesus preach in this version, which is really neat. Jesus taught from the boats. So he actually taught from the boats. And then he said to put out into deep waters and let down the nets for a catch. I highlighted the let down just for fun. It's to kind of poke fun at Luke a little bit. So Luke was probably not a fisherman. And the way they caught the fish was they threw the casting net. They would have used a big net to corral the fish, but they would have cast it. So I think it's kind of funny that Luke maybe didn't know how they fished or used different words, but not a fisherman, right? And so they had been fishing all night long. So all night is a thing. You fish at night. You bring your catch to market when the sun comes up, right? So the best time to fish is at night. Still true today. So people that fish out there, fish at night. It's just the best time to catch fish. And so he lets down the net, and they caught a large number. It's actually a plethora. It's funny that we still have that version of the Greek word today. So they caught a plethora of fish, and the nets began to break. We're going to see that in ours as well. And then, of course, we see James and John. John got a little upgrade here, the sons of Zebedee. And then the take-home message is still the same. Follow him, right? And you'll fish for people. So same story, a little bit more details. And this version is going to connect really directly to John 21. So John would have known that you knew the story. He does not tell it in John. He just assumes that you're going to be able to read about it in Luke. Other connections. Other connections that we'll say is John 21 is going to start with two words that mean after these things. It's not really that exciting. Again, I made this slide whenever I was combating the John 21 as a separate thing that was made. It's standard start. It's used in chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. By the way, after these things is actually used a total of 7 times, just because I count everything. But I just wanted to mention that it's a pretty typical start to a chapter. By the way, he manifested. This is a word that we saw in previous chapters, going all the way back to the prologue of the one and only Son has made him known, right? So kind of fun. A lot of connections to chapter 6, actually. So this connection from 21 to 6, you're going to see a lot. 21 and 6, this is the feeding of the 5,000, especially the first story in there. And so we're going to see various connections. One connection is It's at the Sea of Galilee, right? He actually says the word Sea of Tiberias, and so Tiberias is what he uses in 21. And this one is people were following him, of course, and they are all coming. And Philip says, where are we going to buy bread for all these people? So this story is kind of like about bread first and fish is like secondary. One little funny note here. Philip uses the word bread. And then again, there's the word bread. Oh, sorry, that's Jesus with bread. My bad. So Jesus says bread. Then Philip responds about bread. And then this is the same word in Greek for bread. Bread. If you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's kind of funny because there were 5 barley loaves. And then if you count the word fish, sure enough, 1, 2. So there's 5 words for loaves that are repeated and then 2 fish. These guys spent so much time working on this. I like to notice them just to see the little things that they did. And so not saying that's a divine intervention. That's not the Holy Spirit. That's just the work and effort that was put into making these things. These things are like, it's almost like a modern movie, right? It's like they made a movie that would be read in the evening. And it's just really exciting. They use the number 200 in the story. They actually don't say half a year's wages. They say 200 denarii. The number 200 is used only in this story in 6, and then also in 21, right? So all these connections. By the way, if you think about the way chapter 6 ends, if your memory is good enough to go back that far, it ends with that many disciples are no longer following him, right? So it's like, oh, that's kind of ironic. It's kind of like we're all about following him, right? So chapters 1 through 11 are all about believing, and then this is all about following. Sure enough, Jesus asked them, you don't want to stop following, do you? Stop walking with me. And Simon Peter boldly answers, of course it's Simon Peter. Where would we go? You have the words of eternal life. I'm not going anywhere. You can forget it, right? Gotta love the connections. So we're going to be in Galilee. Why are they in Galilee? Isn't that weird? Because they, Jesus was raised in Jerusalem, and then they are in Jerusalem at Pentecost, and now we're in Galilee. What's up with that? Galilee is perfectly expected. Mark, earlier in the gospel, Jesus said, after I've risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Once he is risen, he says to the women to go, he's going to Galilee, and there you'll see him. So they're supposed to go to Galilee. By the way, a little side note here. Mark was probably the oral words of Peter. At this point in time, Peter doesn't even call himself a disciple, right? So there's all his disciples and Peter, right? It's like, I'm not even worthy to be called a disciple. So I think you can see just how much this denial affected Peter. It crushed Peter, right? And so like he was a broken man over this, wouldn't even be a disciple. Matthew says it as well, go to Galilee. So we're going to Galilee. Makes perfect sense. The Feast of Unleavened Bread would have been 7 days, started by Passover. After that, you go back to Galilee. You can cut straight through Samaria, which is, of course, what Jesus did in chapter 4. Or you can go over to the Jordan, and you can walk along the Jordan. Probably they walked along the Jordan, unless they wanted to not be seen. Then they might have shot right through Samaria. This map also shows coastal route. I don't know of many people taking the coastal route. So Jerusalem here, Bethany would have been very nearby. A lot of these city names you'll recognize. Zoom in on the Sea of Galilee. So here's kind of a zoom in over here. You can see that Tiberias was one of the cities that the Romans built on the lake to control fishing, right? So it's called the Lake of Tiberias. That's what John's readers would have known the lake as. By the way, they built Tiberias. They also built Caesarea. Caesarea is where Pilate would have been most of the year. He would have gone to Jerusalem potentially just for the Feast of Tabernacles and for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So most of his time was spent in the city they built. He just only went down there when he kind of had to, right? You can also see on the map Nazareth, of course, right here. Cana in Galilee. Magdala, so Mary Magdala would have been from here. Capernaum, where he kind of made the new headquarters. Bethsaida, where Philip would have been from. Lots of good things. Last thing I'll say, and then we'll actually start this chapter. It's crazy we haven't started it. Let's talk about fishing, just for fun. So fishing is done with a casting net. Casting net's still a thing. It's weighted on the bottom with a rope kind of going through the bottom. And then when you pull on the rope, it kind of cinches it together, and then the bottom becomes the top, and you pull up your fish. They would have also used potentially a drag net from shore, which is what this video or this image is showing. But what they would have done is, they were boat fishermen, they would have used a trammel net. Trammel net, maybe it's 750 feet long, maybe it's 1,000 feet long, it's like an American football field long. You would have sailed or rowed a big circle, and you would have put everybody in the trammel net. Then you can make the net tighter, tighter, and tighter. And then to actually get the fish out, you would have thrown the casting net right into the middle. So it would have been like this, like shooting fish in a barrel, right? And you would have thrown the casting net into the trammel net zone to catch your fish. Jesus, of course, tells them, hey, don't throw it into the trammel net zone. So this is like how you're trying to catch the fish. This is like you taking, like the old Eve analogy there. Toss it on the other side, right? And so it would have been ludicrous, right? Because like over here is where you've collected, you've worked to get all your fish together over here. He's saying just throw it on the right side of the boat, right? So this picture happens to be done that way, which is fun. By the way, you can watch videos of people. I'll just kind of watch this one. I'll mute him just so that my audio comes in over. This is on the Sea of Galilee. So these guys are on the Sea of Galilee now. He just threw in the casting net. And he's fishing. This is just from the shore, so he's not going to keep any of these fish. But you can see that the casting net goes down, and then he pulls it up, and then he's gonna actually catch some fish here later in the video. They won't catch any fish, and you can see that they're not actually like huge fish. We're not talking about gigantic fish here. These are what I would consider, smaller fish, right? And so, by the way, it's funny. You can see like the fireworks barge that's in the Sea of Galilee now, right? So very, very distant cry from where we're at. By the way, these two guys, they were the ones who found the, there's they call it the Jesus boat. It's like a 28-foot long boat. And so these were the two guys that found it. So they got to be in this video, which is fun. All right, I'll cut that video off there. Go watch the video. It's really good. They mentioned the 53 at that timestamp there. So lots of neat things there. Fish, just to mention it, this chapter is going to talk about the word fish in different ways. It's going to use the word fish 7 times because that's what Luke or John does. Maybe I should say not John, but the editors of John did. They're also going to use different sizes of fish. They're going to talk about tiny fish. They're going to talk about ichthys fish, which are like the big fish. And then the most common word for fish, I don't want to try to pronounce it, but you can see it right there. This is the word that's used in most of the other stories, by the way. And then Jesus, of course, come, take the bread, give it to them, did the same with the fish. That's like verbatim from chapter 6. Just so happened I had lunch 20 minutes ago, and sure enough, the cafeteria was serving fish. So guess what I had? Had me some fish. This logo for ichthys fish, by the way, became a symbol for the Christian logo. They even made an acronym for it. I don't know how old this was, but ichthys in Greek was the letters for Jesus Christ, God, and then Son, Savior, right? And so Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. So it was kind of like a logo back in the day, this ichthys fish. Seen it on tombstones from long ago, potentially as late as the 2nd century, that was a logo. All right, let's go to the handout. Let's actually get into John. I think that's the longest intro I've ever done. So what we do, of course, as a group is we have people read it. So we just read 1 through 14 all the way through. And then we just discuss it, right? What did you see? What did you see? I make some comments on my geeky looking at the Greek, things like that. And then we talked about some other things. So we talked about 153 for a while. I'm going to maybe bore you with this 153 story, but oh well, that's who I am. All right, so let's just kind of read it and go through. So it starts off after these things, and then Jesus manifested. There's 2 references to manifested here, also at the end of the story. So they always make these frames, right? He manifested, which comes from the prologue, the one and only Son revealed him, and it's also used in the upper room discourse as well. By the Sea of Galilee, that is it actually said the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. There's Simon Peter, there's one. Thomas, also known as Didymus, so I'm glad to hear that they're sticking together, right? So Thomas had this almost falling out moment, but he was restored in the last chapter. Nathaniel from Cana in Galilee. Kind of weird to use the whole title. And then you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, this is going to totally connect to chapter 1, right? Like all the way back to the beginning. So saying the full name here just to jog your memory. The sons of Zebedee, that's surprising. So John never refers to himself. He never mentions James. He doesn't even say Mary's name, right? Jesus' mother. He says Jesus' mother, Jesus' mother. So it's really weird to see him say sons of Zebedee. I think this is a frame, actually, where the other authors are kind of showing themselves. I think they added Zebedee. Now, they added it because all these other stories say sons of Zebedee, so they just added it in right there. And 2 other disciples. Who knows who they were, right? There were 7 total. People guessed that these 2 others were probably Philip, who was from Bethsaida. He was probably a fisherman as well. And Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. In fact, I wonder, no evidence of this, I wonder if they were mentioned, and then not the sons, instead of the sons of Zebedee, like they flip-flopped it, right? And then the 2 others would have been James and John, but who knows? Hard to guess. But a lot of people assume that they mention exactly these disciples in the book. So, like, where are Andrew and Philip? They're kind of like missing. And then, there's 2 others. All right. Peter says, I'm going to fish. So they're supposed to be in Galilee. Super. Simon's going to fish. Nothing wrong with it. No big deal. We'll go with you. What a leader, right? And so they went out and they got into the boat. The boat, I don't want to try to pronounce it, Ploion. That was painful to do. I'm sure it's painful to listen. The boat's going to be mentioned 3 times. There's lots of 3s in this chapter. That's the first one. Plain old boat. No big deal. And it was by night. This both makes sense because it would have been a night. It's historically accurate. And it's also kind of a connection to chapter 20. So Mary Magdalene went very early while it was still dark. You could assume that night means that he was doing something bad, right? So like usually nights, like in the darkness, it's kind of bad. I don't think that's what's going on here. Some people say it's like, Peter was leaving the Lord's work and was going back to his career. I don't think so. So I think it's a connection to chapter 20, how Mary got to the tomb while it was still dark. If you think that Peter was messing up, well, then you must think Mary was messing up too, right? Because they're parallel. And I don't think that's the case. All right, digression. They caught nothing. You look that up in Greek, it means nothing, right? So yeah, here's the version with Mary in 20. So early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. So if you remember back to chapter 20, Jesus is always standing places, like Jesus stood among them. Or it says that Jesus came and stood by Mary, right? And so Jesus comes to people, right? So they're together, which is awesome. Jesus comes to them, and the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. How many times have we seen this, right? So Mary didn't realize it was Jesus. The people on the road to Emmaus didn't realize it was Jesus. There's something about realizing this Jesus. You're still involved, right? Like even he doesn't come up and say, hey, I'm Jesus, here's what I'm here to tell you. You still have to be involved to even identify Jesus, which is crazy. He called out to them friends, which really is probably a word for children, might be better. Have you any fish? We sometimes translate it friends because we don't want it to sound derogatory, because it's like children, that'd be derogatory. It was probably children, and children wasn't derogatory, right? I mean, just look at some of these others. He gave us to become the right to become children of God. Admittedly, it's a different word for children. And in chapter 13, he addressed them as little children, right? Couldn't avoid those two. The word for children here, it's actually used 3 times in the Gospel of John. You can look it up. It's kind of fun. One is in chapter 4, the man's son in Cana who need to be healed, his child. That's the word for children here. And then the other is a woman giving birth when she's had the child. So, yeah, I think it's probably a pretty young word. People say that it's like, it's the word used for soldiers, right? Well, soldiers are sometimes called derogatory names. So, but yeah, so children, haven't you any fish? The word for fish here is tiny fish. Like, have you any minnows? Like, have you caught anything? Like anything at all? No, the answer, just too funny. And then Jesus said, cast your net on the right side of the boat. So like where the trammel net's not, right? Boat again here, still just a plain old boat. You will find some. And so when they cast their nets, by the way, in Greek, it actually repeats the word cast. NIV changes it. They're like, I don't want to say cast again. When they did cast, they were unable to haul the nets in because of the plethora of fish. Same word as used in Luke. So a plethora of fish. No surprise there. Plethora. And the word fish changed. They didn't catch no tiny fish. They caught Ixus fish. Big fish. Right? And so a large number of big fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved, so that's John here, right? He says to Peter, "It's the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," lots of repeated things here, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and he cast himself into the water. Literally, it's the word cast again. So cast your nets, when they did cast their net. And then Peter cast himself. I just think that's funny. That's a laugh line in Greek, right? Casting yourself. By the way, I also joke that, in heaven, whenever John and Peter get together, I think they had a little bit of a rivalry, friendly rivalry. Like Peter outran him to the two, or so John outran Peter to the two. I bet you $1 that when you ask Peter, did you hear John say this and that's why you jumped? Peter's like, no, I figured it out all on my own and I jumped. By the way, also really surprising here, clearly Peter has been restored at this point in the story. And so this goes back to there was a private meeting, which we don't know anything about, between Jesus and Peter on the day of the resurrection. He's already been restored because he sees Jesus and he jumps in the water. And so this is another argument for people that say, he went back to fishing. The minute he's at his pinnacle of his career here. He's got the biggest. If you've ever been fishing, you dream about catching big fish. This is the one, man. It's finally happened. And the moment he sees the Lord, forgotten. Right? It's like the parable of finding a pearl of great value. You sell everything you have and you buy that field. And so that's Peter, man. And so the other disciples follow Peter, and there's the word followed again. Interestingly, this time the boat changed. The boat is now a little boat. Why did it go from a boat to a little boat? Well, it became a little boat as soon as they caught the fish. Size is relative, right? Seemed like a good sized boat before, but now that we've got this huge thing of fish in the casting net, suddenly it's a pretty little boat. And so they're towing these big Ixus fish to shore. They weren't far away. I love all these little details John's had. 200 cubits. 200 cubits connects you to chapter 6 as well. It's the only 2 times 200 shows up. 200 can also be a great certainty, right? So there's lots of little things going on with numbers in the world. We, of course, translate it to units, we know, which changes the number, which is kind of too bad. But fortunately, we still have the Greek. They landed, so they got to shore. Presumably, Peter beat them there, but it doesn't really even say that. And they saw the fire of burning coals. I'm going to pause here just for a minute. This word for coals, I don't think I can print anthrakia. I don't know if I said that anywhere close to right. This is used here on the shore. Like, why add that little detail? Well, whenever Peter was standing around in the courtyard, if you remember, it was a coal fire. So there's a connection here to the denial, right? So no surprise, we're setting up for the next story, right? So we're gonna address this denial issue in the next story, and its reference with this burning coals. Also, if you want to connect it even farther back, Isaiah 6:6 in the Septuagint uses the same word, coals, with Isaiah's vision. We'll just kind of read a little bit here. One of the seraphim flew to me. If you know this story well, it's like a vision in the temple, with a coal in his hand. Same word, right? So John picks this word because of the Septuagint from this Isaiah 6:6 story. He'd taken from tongs from the altar. With it, he touched my mouth, because Isaiah had said he was a man of unclean lips. See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. That's like touching. Your sin is atoned for, and that's exactly the story we're going to read with Peter, right? So it's like it's gone, right? So this is a big part of understanding Jesus, right? And so Isaiah was sent to go forward. I will go, and Peter is sent to go forwards. All right. So little, just in a word, all these connections just pop. And so Jesus, by the way, he had some fish. He had normal sized fish. This is the word that's most common for fish. And by the way, some bread, just in case you needed a connection to chapter 6 again. And so Jesus said, bring your fish. So bring your work. You've been working, your harvesters, bring it so the harvester and the sower can be happy together, right? And so Simon Peter went back onto the boat. It doesn't actually say boat in the Greek there, but NIV does. He brought it ashore. It was full of large fish, 153 to be exact. We'll get into that one. But even with so many, the net was not torn. So up here, the not torn was also used. It says it up there somewhere. And so Jesus said to them, "Come." So we've seen this word "come" throughout the Gospels, erhoma or something like that. Have some breakfast. None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" That's kind of a weird thing, right? They knew it was the Lord. By the way, whenever you see weird things, like it was almost like awkward that they're like, so nobody said, "Hey, are you Jesus?" Nobody said that, right? It's weird, and let weird things shape you, right? So this is written for us to meditate on and think about it. Like, why the awkwardness, right? So again, somehow, just like seeing Jesus, you have to make a decision about what reality is, right? And so it's crazy because, like, in our mind, we expect him to say, "Hey, I'm Jesus. Here's what I'm come to tell you," right? But that's not really the way it was, right? And so, of course, non-believers use this as leverage. Like, I wasn't Jesus. He never even claimed to be Jesus, right? But it was. I'm telling you, it was. And they had to know it, right? Jesus came, continued to use this word "come." By the way, they went out to fish, right? So this is going out to the world and coming back in. He took the bread, gave it to them. I almost wish it had said gave thanks and gave it to them. And then he did the same with the fish. The word for "did the same" is repeated here and in chapter 6. Same, right? So they are having the same experience that they've had with him in chapter 6. They're having the same experience they did when they started with him. And so this was the third time, love the numbers, right? So the third time, 3 kind of represents a resurrection, that he manifested to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Cool. Awesome story. The meaning of the story is pretty straightforward. Doing their own thing all night long, doing it the right way, using trammel nets, doing things, catching nothing, right? Not necessarily like sinning, doing bad. It just resulted in nothing. Like the best of human wisdom, right? Listen to Jesus. 153 ichthys fish, right? And so a great catch. So definitely is an abundance. It's funny, today's commercial fishermen, if they catch 153, that is not a good day, right? But we know that it's an abundance before we even look at the number anymore. I'm a giant dork. I look at numbers. It's what I do. Let's go on a numbers tangent. Hopefully this tangent won't bore people that don't like numbers, but I do like numbers. Numbers have been highly popular by another one of John's writings, at least we assume it's John, from Revelation. So I put a whole big chunk in here. You can read the whole big chunk if you want. It's the mark of people who are opposed to God, right? And then he goes, one verse causes all this stuff on the internet, right? This calls for wisdom. So you got to like pause and like do some technical stuff here. I don't think John had any idea what we would do in the technical world. This addition of 3-digit numbers is what we're talking about here. Let the person who has insight calculate the number. Who here can do 3-digit addition? So calculate the number of the beast. Now that's actually kind of confusing. This is going to involve some language skills. That's going to be harder. For it is the number of a man. So you can read all about this on the internet. People love this. Almost certainly Nero. And that number is 666. So you don't need to look up the symbolism of the number to understand the story. People who are opposed to God are like the beast that Daniel mentioned. People that are part of these machines that you'll read about in Revelation that are opposed to God. Described as 666, again with number fun. 12 represented Israel, so 6 would have represented half of 12, which would be a non-Israelite, which would be Babylon. These number theory things. 666, the resurrection of Babylon, right? Bible Project has a good video on this one. I will let this one play. I'll try to get the sound to come through.
Fascinated readers for thousands of years. But this was not a mystery to John. He spoke Hebrew and Greek, and Hebrew letters were also numbers. If you spell the Greek words Nero Caesar and the word beast in Hebrew, each one amounts to 666. Now, John isn't saying that Nero was the only...
All right, cool. So we'll cut it off there. But that video is fun to watch. They explain the whole thing in like one sentence. I'm going to do the same thing, but in half an hour. Maybe not half an hour, but a little bit. So I'll just say it in more details, just in case you didn't fully understand what Bible Project said there. So Hebrew uses 22 symbols. Technically, some of them have two forms. So like mem's got if it's in the middle of the word or if it's the end of the word. Noon has if it's in the middle of the word, and then if it's the end, it's just a big bar. By the way, there's a bunch of these big bars. Vav or Wav is just a bar. Zion is almost a bar. It's just got this little tittle at the top that makes it different. And you can see that there's a couple that have this final form. Each of these was a number. There were no uppercase letters and lowercase. This is it, right? There were no numbers. This is it, right? So these are your uppercases. These are your lowercases. These are your numbers, all of the above. 22 letters did not represent the numbers 1 through 22. You got to look at the thing in black for this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, just like you'd expect. And then it goes 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And then 200, 300, 400 with Tav at the end of 400. First question people ask is, what happens when you want to show a number that's bigger than, say, 1,000, right? You don't, right? We just don't know. We didn't need numbers that big back then, right? And so the fun thing about this system is the order doesn't matter. So if you had a number, like, I don't know, if you had the number 12, right? So 12 is going to be a yod and a bait. And it doesn't matter if you say bait yod or yod bait, it's 12 either way. I'm sure they had a system for it, but the fun thing about that is then you can spell words. This is a game that all fishermen are going to play. You got to count your fish because you got to pay taxes on them, right? You got to pay 20% tax or even up to 40% tax at other times. You got to pay Rome. You got to pay Herod Antipas. You've got to pay the temple tax. You got to do a lot of math to be a fisherman, right? Lots of taxes. People knew about this. People read the Old Testament. And people found that in the Old Testament, there are what's called gematria. I got to figure out how to remember how to say that word. And so gematria is a word that is a number that's in the Bible, right? Like this is like super dorks. The example that I know of, the only example I know of, is from Genesis 14:14. Abram. So this is a long time ago. This is like still named Abram, not even Abraham yet. This is like 2700 BC. So like it's funny. From me to Jesus is like 2000, and then from Jesus to Abraham is like 2700. So this is an old ancient story. It's like super old. And apparently they knew that it was exactly 318 men. So whenever Lot got taken, he went to rescue him. He brought 318 men, and people are like, that is weird. 318. Well, it turns out, if you look at the word Eliezer, so Abram's head servant was Eliezer. Eliezer was going to get his inheritance because he had no children, so Eliezer was going to get things. Eliezer is a name, but it's actually kind of two words smushed together. It's El, which is an abbreviation of Elohim, which is God, and then Azer. And Azer is a word from Genesis 2, where it wasn't good that Adam was alone, and so God made him an Azer. It's a like indispensable helper, is another way to say it. And so people went through and they discovered that Eliezer, if you look at it, the first letter is an Aleph. Aleph has a numeric value of 1. Lamed has a numeric value of 30, so 1 and 30. And then you add to that a Yod, which is a 10. So we're up to what, 41. Ayin, where's Ayin at? It takes me a little while to do this. 70, what is that, 110? I kind of lost track. And then 110 goes to 118 with the Zayin. And then 118 pops up by 200 more. Boom, 318, right? So everybody knew how to do these things back then. So they discovered the 318. John would have read this, and he probably thought it was pretty cool that we use gematria in the Bible, right? A few more details just for fun. I wrote it from left to right here because that's what you're used to. But Hebrew is, of course, right to left. I'm guessing a lot of people know that. Also, if you zoom in on this, you can see there's all these little dots and things like this. These dots are vowel pointings. There were no vowels in Hebrew. And so these dots were added by the Masoretes, so that we would know how to pronounce things. But they weren't really there. Another fun fact about the word Eliezer is it's actually the same as the word Lazarus. Yeah, for real. So whenever Jesus said, like, Lazarus, come out. I mean, he said Eliezer, right? Maybe he pronounced it different. The reason they're the same word is because in Greek, the E was a silent letter. The Aleph was silent. So the first letter is really the L. Laz. So the Z here, Laz, And then in Greek, you just add an os, like Jesus, us, right? And so it just gets added to the end when it comes to Greek. So Lazarus. So Lazarus is actually in John's story as well. So I'm sure that John noticed this gematria from the Old Testament. A fun thing you can do if you ever have any interest, you can figure out what your name is in gematria, so you can get your numeric score. So for example, my name is David. And the nice thing about David is in the Old Testament. And so it's a Delet and then a Vav with a dot on top that makes it a Holum, I think is how you say it. And then another Delet. And so my score is 14, which is actually kind of a fun number. Matthew used 14 a lot, so it's like, yeah, fun number. That's good. Also, just for fun, I put in David Fisher one time. It's interesting. Whenever I type David Fisher, it's more formal. It switched the David. It's like I was kind of surprised by that. It used Delet Yod Vav Vav Yod Delet, still symmetric, which is kind of fun. And so that actually is going to be important as we get into this. Vav Vav is kind of a VV, double Vav, is kind of a special letter. It forces it to be a consonant is really what it does. And so that's another way to do David, which by the way is 40. I'm crushing these biblical numbers, right? So apparently I'm a great completion and I'm a test. I'm not quite sure what that means. But this, if you ever have Vav Vav together, it definitely is a consonant and it definitely has a V sound. In those days, it was probably more of a W sound, so it probably was pronounced Dawid, which is fine. So if you want to, you can go to that URL. You can put in your name. You can score yourself to figure out what your number is. Got off track there with gematria. Next, what we need to do is we need to do what John did. And what John did is he would convert Greek to Hebrew. Which actually makes perfect sense, right? So every time we have a Greek word, we write below it what it is in English. Does that make sense? So John would do the same thing in Greek, right? So instead of to Hebrew. So instead of going from Greek to English, like from a language you've got to work with to the language you really know, he did Greek to Hebrew. So it's clear that he didn't really know Greek all that well. He just had to communicate with it because he knew he could see the writing on the wall. You write something in Hebrew, it's not going to last. You got to put it in Greek if you want to communicate with people. And so he looked at words like beast, therion, and he would have thought of it as the Hebrew letters. That's just the way that we see things in English. He would have done the same thing. And whenever he sees Hebrew letters, I mean, he can't help it. He was a fisherman his whole life. You just do the math, right? You just see what it is. Like, oh, beast is 666, like resurrection of Babylon here. And then they also would have known Caesar. So this one was not necessarily via Greek. This is just in Hebrew. They would have written it like this. It looks like Neron Czar, right? Like Khazar, right? So this is apparently how they would have written it in Hebrew. I haven't researched that myself. It's just what the internet says, and you got to trust the internet, right? And so if you look at the Hebrew version of his name, it would have also worked out to be 666. And I think that that's a very reasonable statement. So I don't necessarily feel a need to look into it too much more. You can go online and you can judge for yourself on that one. That's not really the point of what I'm up to here. Probably this was written like 15 years after Nero, and perhaps 666 was a way to refer to Nero without saying his name. Don't really know. The thing that I'm curious about is the 153, because that's what we're doing today. So here's what I want you to try to do. I will give you a hint. It's in the verse. So whenever I looked at this, I tried a lot of different things. I didn't start with the knowledge that it was in the verse. But the way these kind of like fun mysteries work is you have to have somebody teach you the rules. And so Bible Project taught me all the rules, right? So I love the Bible Project classroom talked about the 318. The Bible Project video that I just showed you there taught about the beast and the Caesar Nero. And so now it's your turn. So I'm telling you, here's some Greek letters. Here is their transliterated Hebrew letters. Here are the values of the transliterated Hebrew letters. Try it. So pause the video. See if you can look at the verse. So I've limited you to like whatever 25 options here. See if you can guess what word you think it might be. And so you can decide which word you want to try first. Maybe you'll try fish. So here's the word ixis. So if I was to try ixis, I would have to say that it's an iota. And so an iota would basically be like a yod. And then it would be, what's the next one? I'm not very good at these right now. A CH sound. CH sound might have been a sadi, which would be a 90. One thing I will tell you as you try to do a couple of these words, if you ever see like a resh in there, a resh is 200 by itself, right? It's like Petrus has a row in it, which would have been transliterated to a resh. You know it's out. So if you would like to have this fun, pause the video and go looking for the word. Spoiler alert, you might find it's 152, but that's the right word if you find it. All right, so if you like to play this game, I'm sure you've played it by now. Pause me so I don't spoil it for you. Let's just tell you the answer now. So whenever I played this game a long time ago. I was doing it in code, which was fun. And I actually have like a log of like every word that I tried. It took me 12 guesses, which I don't know if that's embarrassing or what. But I tried ixis first, and so I like figured out what ixis was. I think I've got the file over here. I can just run it. What day did I do this on? This is a while back. Oh, well, I can't see the date. And so, I was using this to try to help me solve it. So I'd Unicode it first and just see what it is in English, and then I'd figure out what it was in Hebrew, and then I'd score it. So I did ixis, I did large, I did distended. I got frustrated and looked on the internet, and I saw that Mary Magdalene was 153, but I'm not quite sure how that's useful to me. I checked the net. I knew that it had to be somewhere near the verse just because of how the others worked, right? And eventually I came across it. Tosutan. And so why is it Tosutan? So if you go through and you look at Tosutan, honestly, I kind of brute forced it, so I didn't know why I picked this word. I just kind of brute forced it. It comes up to 152, which is a problem because it misses by one. We also have a problem of there's two vavs together, right? So two vavs is always a consonant, whereas tosutan is an O and a U. It's a vav, holum, and a sharuk here, which is also a vav. So John, in trying to remember these Greek words, that wouldn't have worked because that would have been a V in his world. And so we had to fix that problem, and also we got this problem with the numbers. And I think what almost certainly he did is he broke them up with a silent letter. He broke them up with a silent aleph, so no vowel with it, just a silent letter. And sure enough, aleph is worth 1, which bumps you up to 153. So now you've got to ask yourself, does this make sense, right? Does this solution to things actually kind of compute? You've got to ask yourself, does it contribute to? Oops, I lost my page number here. I put it at the end. That's right, just so I wouldn't accidentally spoil it for you. Does it make sense? Does it actually support what we already knew about the story? It actually does, because it was showing that 153 is a lot, which today's numbers, 153 may not be a lot. But it's showing again, try things your own way. Nothing. It reminds me a lot of John chapter 15, the vine and the branches. I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing, right? And so we get a connection back to John 15 here as well. Also, if you read the chapter, it was a net full of fish that were large, so mega ixus fish, 153. And then there's this conjunction, K, which... I forgot to pronounce it. And it usually means and, but it can actually mean any sort of connection. It's kind of like vav in Hebrew. It's a generic connection word. So it can mean namely, tosutan. And so it actually is very directly connected. By the way, you can also do fun things. I don't think you really need to do this. But you can double check your work through these transliteration tools. So you can take a word that you think it is, and then plug it in. So let's say that if I grab this word, so if I took this word, this is a Greek word, no, this is a Hebrew word, so I'm gonna have to put it into this one. When I say transliterate, you can see that without the aleph, it actually transliterates it kind of funny. tosuoton, right? And so it kind of is a weird thing there. But if you take it with the aleph and you transliterate it, you can see that it fixes the problem with the aleph in there. Tosuuton, right? So just kind of fun things that you can do with technology these days. All right, I think that I've beat that one into the ground. So the people that are bored are super bored. I made a little summary table here of the 4 gematrias that I know of in the Bible, this 153 being the most recent one. Let's talk about something more important. Sorry, I love numbers so much. Let's talk about the next story. Hey, let's talk about the restoration of Peter instead of numbers. Perhaps that is more meaningful. The first thing I want to say about this story is to kind of set it up some, in that we really see a lot of similarities to chapter 20, which again shows this is not really an epilogue. This is a pairing chapter to 20. And if you start looking for it, man, you're just going to keep on seeing. So let's look at Thomas and Peter similarities. So Thomas, famously in chapter 11, you got to go way back, they're going to go to Lazarus. And Thomas is like, hey, we're going to all die. And Thomas says, let's go. Like, I'm in. I'm ready, right? Let us all go so that we may die with him. So very much boldness. They even say his full name, Thomas, also known as Didymus. By the way, if you wanted to connect that to chapter 21, chapter 20. And of course, Peter says virtually the exact same thing, and this is at the Last Supper. Jesus tells him he's going to deny him, and he says, I will follow you now. The word follow, that's funny how follow keeps coming up. I will lay down my life for you. So this boldness. The next thing we see is failure. So the Thomas story is about believing, because so chapter 20 is kind of like reflecting back to the 1 through 11. And Thomas, everybody told him that we saw him. He heard it from the women. He said, nope, don't believe. I've got 3 criteria. See the nail marks, put my finger where the nails were, put my hand in his side. I will not believe, right? So his failure, not a believer. And then Peter's failure, again, we've kind of got this, it's like the believer column and the follower column. You're one of his disciples. Disciple means like follower, not a follower. Not a follower. Again, he denied it. The rooster crowed. So 3 failures. And then we get the restoration in 20 of Thomas to believe. A threefold restoration. Put your finger here, which is the number 2 there. I'm not sure why they changed the order, but they did. See my hands. Reach your hand, put it into my side. Stop unbelieving and believe. So the restoration to Thomas to be a believer. The restoration to Peter is the next step in your Christian walk. It's to be a follower, right? So be a disciple, follow me. Like make your belief be an active, important part of your life and continue to grow. And so he tells him to feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. I will talk about that later. Always my sheep, right? And then the last thing we see for both of them, and he did it, right? So Thomas, my Lord, my God, he believed, right? Peter, follower, you know it. He did it. Day of Pentecost came. Peter stood up and raised his voice, and he addressed the crowd. And 3,000 people, 3,000, resurrection, and numbers greater than Jesus ever saw, right? So it's just pretty exciting. So you can see, it doesn't take a lot to see the similarities here. So there's the very early morning story. While it was still dark, Jesus stood. Very early in the morning, they were fishing. Jesus stood on the shore. Threefold restoration of Thomas to believe. Threefold restoration of Peter to follow with the coals. And then we get the summary sentence for 1 through 11, the summary sentence of 12 through 21. I'll get off my high horse, but this is not an epilogue. This is strongly connected to chapter 20 in ways that you cannot deny. Let's go read it. So we'll finish up here, finishing up our amazing chapter of just truly amazing book with this restoration of Peter. What better way to finish? When they'd finished eating, he said to Simon Peter, he didn't call him Peter, notice he calls him Simon, son of John. For those of you that got in trouble when you were younger, when you get called your full name, you better listen, right? Do you love me more than these? We'll get into the Greek in a little bit. Yes, is the answer. You know that I love you. Feed my lambs. ask him again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Notice that the more than these is missing the second time. Yes, is the answer. You know I love you. Take care of my sheep. So being restored to useful work. Simon, son of John, do you love me? He was hurt this time because he asked him a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, it's interesting. He doesn't even remember to say yes. He's just like, he's distraught over this. You know all things. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. So you don't have to go deeper to get it. Couldn't be clearer. Peter, you're a person I've restored. I plan to use you for good works. You're going to do these things. Can't leave it at that. Of course, we got to go deeper. The first thing I'll say is when you go deeper, when you go deeper, you change the meaning of the story, you done messed up, right? And so when you go deeper, you start looking at agape and phileo, and you make the meaning different, you messed up, right? And so let's go deeper, and let's try to keep in mind that we already know what the story means. We're just trying to understand it at a deeper level. And so sure enough, if you go looking at the Greek, it will actually be, do you agape me more than these? I've kind of summarized as, do you love me at level 3, right? And Peter says yes. So don't think that Peter suddenly not gotten bold. He starts with yes. He's also gotten humbler. He says, you know that I love you. And sure enough, his word here is phileo, which most people interpret as more of a level 1 kind of love, right? They're used interchangeably a lot of places in the Bible. Here they're different, but don't take it too far, right? He also uses other words. He uses different words for know. He says Edo. It's a different version of that, but that's the base word. And it means to like perceive something, and you know it. It's fact. You haven't necessarily experienced it, but you know it. The stronger one is gnosko, right? So that's kind of the big one. Feed my lambs. We'll come back to that part. And so we ask him again, do you agape me? So this is like a level 2. Do you level 2 love me? By the way, people make a big deal about agape and phileo, but keep in mind, these guys weren't speaking Greek. Like, they were speaking Aramaic, right? Which is closer to Hebrew. It would have been like Rahakim or something like that. It wasn't even phileo or agape anyway. But he asked him, do you love me at level 2? Which is obviously higher than what he had said before, because he'd mentioned level 1 before. And he answered again, you know that I love you. Again, he uses the word Edo, and Neela left us. And he's told to take care of my sheep. Third time, ask what he's been saying all along. He asks specifically, phileo me. And Peter says, you perceive all things. In fact, you have experienced, you gnosko, you were there when I denied you. You looked me in the eyes, right? You know that this is true, right? And so that's where we finish with feed my sheep. The 3 responses are interesting. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. Different words can get used here, but essentially the lambs and sheep, it's kind of like the young, potentially the young believers, people new to Christianity. Sheep is like the mature, right? So the people that have been around for a while, right? Feed and take care of, they kind of have different definitions. Shepherd, I think that's misspelled there. And so really feed is more like love on them, right? Like give them spiritual food, right? Like preach to them the word, right? Shepherd is a little bit more like protect. Discipline can be part of shepherding. Like you've got the rod and my staff, right? So it can be a little bit more physical to help keep people, let them know I'm confronting you, you're making a mistake, right? And so that is loving the mature. And then he finishes with a fun combination. Nurture my mature as well, right? So they need love too. No better story of restoration to finish this thing off. Keeps on going. Very truly I tell you, this is the amen, amen, or verily, verily. We've been seeing these throughout John. We haven't had one since chapter 16. Here's the final 2 amens, amen 49 and amen 50. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. Perhaps you remember earlier in this chapter where you wrapped on your outer garment. So you dressed yourself, you girded yourself, and then you jumped in the water, right? You cast yourself into the water. And by the way, people followed you. And when you're older, you're going to stretch out your hands, kind of an expression for crucifixion. Someone else will gird you, and they will lead you where you don't want to go. John doesn't leave this open interpretation. He just says that Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death Peter was going to glorify God, right? Very clear. Peter also understood it as fine. So this is 30 years earlier. This is Peter writing. I'm just going to read the whole thing because it's really good. This is coming from 2 Peter. I will always remind you of the things, even though you know them and are firmly established in the truth you have. I think it's right for me to refresh your memory as long as I live in the tent of this body, because I know that I will soon put it aside, as our Lord Jesus Christ has made clear to me. So right here, Jesus has made clear to me. It also makes me wonder about the story in Acts when James was killed and he was being led around. Did he think that was the time? It depends on how he interpreted the word old, because if he interpreted, when he was 45 as old, he probably was pretty worried. He made it into his 60s probably is what we think instead. And so, yeah, old wasn't 45. So he was rescued in that story with James, but not later. The Christian tradition tells us he was crucified probably by Nero Caesar around like 62 or so. And the story is, I don't know why I laughed. The story is that he asked to be crucified upside down. Hard to say what truth is in that, but he was crucified as well. I will make every effort to see that after my departure, I will always be able, you will always be able to remember these things. For we did not follow cleverly inventive stories when we told you about the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, when he came in power. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So perfect collaboration with what you expect to see in the story. Then he said to him, follow me, right? By the way, we didn't talk about this. I kind of alluded to it earlier. This is very much written as if this definitively happened after breakfast. But I will say that there's a little bit of a doubt in my mind about that, just because, like, the literary symmetry is quite unavoidable, right? Like, it's clear that somebody literarily set this up. It was actually legal in this time, I'm just going to go way back here, to displace stories, which is kind of like, really? That you can displace stories? This could have been the words that Jesus had with Peter on that day, right? And it was totally legal. I know this sounds weird in our culture, to take a story and displace it to another location, so long as you have the same meaning. So it could have been a displaced story. It could have been that there was something that happened privately with Peter. A lot of people like to say this, and then something publicly that happened with Peter at the Sea of Galilee. Honestly, I think that argument is because we want to preserve the way we see the world, but it was totally valid for this just to be a display story, which is what I tend to think. It's the simpler solution in my mind. Then we get to kind of the ends. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him. By the way, just clarifying, this is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the Last Supper and said, Lord, this is going to betray you. I didn't add that. That's in there. Like these authors want to make it very clear. We get it. Peter saw him and said, Lord, what about him? If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? You must follow me. So we get these certainty, these doubles, right? Because Jesus said that, there was a rumor that he'd never die until the Lord came again, but that's not what he said. He just said, if I want him to remain alive, what's it to you? So you worry about you. Don't compare yourself to John, right? And then we get our kind of conclusion statement for this section. This is the disciple who testifies to these things. He wrote them down. So just being very clear, he wrote them down. We know his testimony is true. We've got an unbroken chain of he witnessed the death, he witnessed the resurrection. Potentially, we know the names of some of these people. Polycarp is the first one that comes to mind. Irenaeus wrote down that his mentor, Polycarp, said that he was a disciple of John. So potentially part of this we could have been Polycarp, not that we need to know names of who these disciples were. But we wonder how much of John was there, Polished. Because really John, again, one of the best ways to think about it, these were read like in the evening as evening entertainment, right? John is broken up into chapters by us, but I think also by the authors, to kind of like make little breaks. So you'd read a chapter from chunk to chunk. You'd read the whole thing in a single evening. It takes you about 2 hours to read John all the way through. It's the equivalent of a movie, right? And so really we as the movie producers, right, who took these eyewitness stories and made them into a memorizable, effective product, right? So it's just really kind of neat how this whole thing works. Jesus did many other things as well. Echo back to chapter 20, many other signs. In chapter 20, it says, "These are written so you believe," and here it's kind of flowery. If every one of them were written down, I suppose not even the whole world would have enough room for the books that would be written. And that's the end. So I'll just kind of reflect for a minute here. Oops, that's sideways. So Gospel of John, just have really enjoyed going through it with you. Hopefully you've enjoyed it some. But man, from beginning to end, just a tremendous account. So now that you kind of know more about the authorship, go back and read it again with a new set of eyes for beginning to end. Think about John, who wrote the original, wrote down the original stories, and then the editors who have massaged it and probably added a lot of these word connections that I like so much. And then if you're willing to quit thinking of chapter 21 as an epilogue and think it is strongly connected to chapter 20, and you'll make me happy. All right, thanks for joining us. Hope you had fun. See you when we get to Acts, which is a great next book to read. Bye.